She lay down in her small room at the nursing home, clutching a handwritten note. Not a will, not an estate. Just the truth her only son had refused to acknowledge for 35 years. And when that letter was opened, the successful man sitting in his million-dollar office suddenly realized he had built his entire life on the spine of the mother he had forgotten. If you're watching this video, hit like now and comment the name of the city you're watching in. I want to know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because the most heartbreaking thing isn't death. It's what she wrote before she closed her eyes. I still remember the exact sound of the phone ringing in that empty house. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November, gray outside. The kind of cold that settles into the walls and stays there. I was 58 years old, sitting at the small kitchen table in my room at the Willowbrook Senior Residence, eating soup that had gone lukewarm because I kept waiting, the way I had waited for so many things in my life, before I finally accepted that waiting doesn't change the temperature of soup, and it doesn't change the temperature of people either. The phone rang 4 times. Then it stopped. No voicemail, no callback, no text that said, "Sorry, Mom, I was in a meeting, I'll call you tonight." Just silence. The particular kind of silence that you learn to recognize after enough years of it. A silence that has a shape to it, almost a weight. The silence of someone who saw your name on their screen, considered it for 4 rings, and then made a decision. I picked up my spoon and kept eating. That was the thing about me that nobody ever fully understood. Not the women I played cards with on Wednesday evenings, not the staff at Willowbrook who always smiled too brightly when they saw me sitting alone, not even my oldest friend, Dottie Marsh, who had known me since I was 24 years old and still nursing a broken heart from a man who had walked out the door and never came back. They all expected me to fall apart, to weep dramatically, to curse my son's name or write angry things on paper. But I didn't fall apart. I had learned very early in my life that falling apart is a luxury that some women simply cannot afford. My name is Evelyn Harper, and this is the story of everything I never said out loud. I grew up in Mill Haven, Ohio, the second of 4 daughters in a house that was too small and a family that stretched every dollar until it nearly snapped. My father worked at a processing plant. My mother cleaned houses on weekends. There was never quite enough of anything, but there was always something. Enough food that nobody went to sleep hungry, enough love that we didn't know we were poor until someone from school said something unkind and made it obvious. I married Daniel Harper at 22, which my mother called romantic and my father called rushed. They were both right, as it turned out. Daniel was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, almost accidentally, in a way that makes you feel like you've been chosen for something special. He had dark eyes and a restless energy and a habit of making promises that he believed wholeheartedly at the time he made them. He was also, I would later understand, constitutionally incapable of staying in one place. We had 3 years together, good years mostly, years where we argued about money and laughed about nothing and stayed up too late on nights we couldn't afford to stay up late. And then Landon came. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born at 4:17 in the morning, with a full head of dark hair and his father's eyes. And for a few months I thought that would be the thing that anchored Daniel to us, that a baby would be the weight he needed. But some men aren't built to be anchored. I know that now. Daniel left when Landon was 14 months old. He didn't leave dramatically. He didn't slam doors or make speeches. He just came home one afternoon, packed 2 bags with a kind of quiet efficiency that, in retrospect, suggested he had been thinking about it for a long time and said, "Evie, I'm not able to do this. Not I don't love you, not I never wanted this, just I'm not able to do this." I stood in our small living room with Landon on my hip, and I looked at this man who had promised me a life, and I said, "I remember this so clearly. Okay. Just that. Okay." He left. He sent money for a year intermittently in amounts that didn't follow any particular logic. Then the money stopped and the contact stopped, and Landon grew up knowing his father as a name without a face, which I always thought was somehow worse than not knowing the name at all. But I didn't have time to sit with the grief of that. I had a 14-month-old who needed to eat. I worked at Hartley's department store for 11 years, women's shoes, which is a department that requires a specific tolerance for people's feet and their opinions about their feet. And I had both. I worked the morning shift and came home at 3 and picked Landon up from Mrs. Geary next door, who charged me $12 a week and always handed him back to me with a little more jam on his face than seemed strictly necessary, but who was kind in all the ways that mattered. On nights I worked late to cover shifts for extra money. Mrs. Geary kept Landon until I came home, sometimes past 10, sometimes past 11. I always brought her something small, a bottle of hand lotion, a box of crackers, a magazine. I couldn't pay her more, but I could make her feel appreciated, and I understood early that appreciation costs nothing and matters enormously. Landon was a serious child, quiet. He had that thing that some children have where they understand more than they say, where they're processing the world through eyes that are a few years older than their actual age. I used to watch him doing homework at the kitchen table and see something in the set of his jaw that looked so much like Daniel that my chest would tighten unexpectedly. Not from grief, more from the particular loneliness of loving someone who looks like someone who hurt you. He was also, even as a small boy, deeply concerned with what other people had. I noticed it first when he was 7. His classmate Robbie Fenton got a new bicycle, a 10-speed with a red frame, and Landon came home and sat at the table with this flat, concentrated expression and said, "Why doesn't my bicycle have gears?" His bicycle was a second-hand Huffy I'd bought for $18 at a yard sale and repainted blue with enamel paint I found at the hardware store. It was perfectly functional. "Because yours doesn't need gears," I told him. "You live on a flat street." He didn't say anything else about it, but I saw it, a small, precise calculation happening behind his eyes. The awareness of difference, the beginning of a certain kind of hunger that I wouldn't fully understand until many years later. I didn't think it was wrong to want things. Wanting things is human. What I didn't see coming was the particular direction that hunger would eventually turn. Oh, he was a good student, genuinely, not just in the way that parents say that. His teachers wrote things on his report cards like engaged and exceptionally analytical, and once, memorably, Landon sees through problems in a way that other students his age don't. He tested well. He earned a partial scholarship to Crestfield University, which was 2 hours from Millhaven, and had a business program that his guidance counselor said was the real thing. The partial scholarship covered 60% of the costs. The other 40% I carried. I need to say this plainly because I want you to understand what I mean when I say I carried it. I don't mean I found the money easily. I mean I sold things. I worked additional jobs. I took a second position at a copy center 3 evenings a week, running a machine that smelled of ink and hot plastic, standing on a concrete floor in shoes that were not built for concrete floors, until my feet ached in a way that didn't fully go away even on weekends. In Landon's second year at Crestfield, my car's transmission failed. I needed the car to get to both jobs. I didn't have the money for the repair. I sold my wedding ring. It wasn't worth much. Daniel and I had married young and poor, and the ring reflected that. A simple gold band with a small chip of diamond. The jeweler gave me $420, which was about $300 more than the repair cost. I put the difference into Landon's tuition account and told myself I didn't need a ring anyway. It was just metal. It didn't mean anything. The thing is, I believed that. I wasn't performing martyrdom. I genuinely believed that what I was giving was less important than what Landon was building. That's the thing about that kind of love. It doesn't feel like sacrifice while you're doing it. It just feels like the obvious thing, the only thing, the thing that of course you do. I didn't tell Landon about the ring. I didn't tell him about the copy center. I didn't tell him a lot of things, and I have thought about that a great deal since then. Whether that was wisdom or whether it was a kind of mistake, a way of making myself invisible in my own son's life story, erasing the inconvenient evidence of what his education actually cost. The other thing I didn't tell him, and this one I think about differently now, was about my health. In Landon's third year at Crestfield, I found a lump, small, the size of a pea, in my left breast. I went to Dr. Felton on a Thursday morning before my shift at Hartley's, and he referred me to a specialist, and 3 weeks and several appointments later, they told me it was early stage, treatable, that the prognosis was good, that I was fortunate to have caught it when I did. The treatment would be taxing, they said. I would need to take time off work. I would be exhausted in ways that were hard to predict. I sat in Dr. Felton's office, and I did the arithmetic. Landon had 1 year left at Crestfield. 1 year. If he knew I was sick, he might leave. He might insist on coming home, taking some other path, something smaller and safer because his mother needed him. And then what? Then everything I had given would become a story that ended in the middle instead of the place it was supposed to end. I said, I'd like to discuss a schedule that doesn't require extended leave. Dr. Felton looked at me across his desk the way people look at you when they understand what you're doing and are not sure they should allow it. I said, my son is finishing his degree in 14 months. I need to get there. He arranged a treatment schedule that was brutal in the way I was braced for. I went to my appointments on Tuesdays, which was my day off from Hartley's. I allowed myself to be sick on Tuesday evenings and Wednesday mornings, and then I pressed myself back into shape by Wednesday afternoon because I had a shift at 3. I ate what they told me to eat. I rested when I could. I didn't complain, not because I'm stoic by nature, but because there was no one in my daily life who I could afford to fall apart in front of. Dottie Marsh knew. She drove me to 2 of my appointments and sat in waiting rooms reading magazines and pretending not to cry. I told her, if you tell Landon, I will never forgive you. She believed me because she knew me, and she kept the secret. Landon graduated from Crestfield on a Saturday in May with a degree in business administration and a job offer already in hand from a financial consulting firm in Chicago called Meridian Partners. He wore a blue gown and walked across the stage in the sun and shook hands with a dean I'd never met, and I sat in the bleachers with a fever that I had been managing for 4 days with over-the-counter medication, and I clapped until my hands hurt. He found me after the ceremony. He hugged me. He smelled like the same shampoo he'd been using since high school, something clean and a little citrusy, and for a moment I held on slightly longer than the occasion required because I was so relieved. I had gotten him there. I had made it to this exact moment, and I was still upright, and he didn't know the cost of any of it, and that felt, in that moment, like success. You look tired, Mom, he said. I've been busy, I said. Go celebrate with your friends. Chicago changed him. I understood that. I was not naive about what cities do to people, what certain kinds of success does to people. He was good at his job. He moved quickly through the ranks at Meridian, which was a firm that prided itself on a particular kind of high-polish professionalism. Tailored suits, client dinners at restaurants I had never heard of, apartments in neighborhoods whose names meant something specific. The first year he called every Sunday. Sometimes the calls were long. Sometimes they were just 20 minutes, squeezed between other things, but they were there. He asked about Millhaven, about Dottie, about Mrs. Geary, who had since retired from babysitting and spent most of her time gardening. He asked about me with the particular brand of concern that meant he didn't want the real answer, just confirmation that everything was fine. Everything was fine. That's what I told him. Everything is fine, Landon. He met Cassandra Whitfield at a company fundraiser in his second year in Chicago. I heard about her in increments, first as someone I've been seeing, then as someone I think is pretty serious, then as Cassie's family is having us to their place in Connecticut for the holidays, so I won't be able to make it home this year. I said, of course. That sounds lovely. I spent that Christmas with Dottie and her daughter's husband and their 2 small children who were loud in the best possible way. It was a good Christmas. I told myself it was a good Christmas, and I mostly believed it. Cassandra Whitfield came from the kind of family that Landon had been calibrating toward since he was 7 years old and noticed Robbie Fenton's 10-speed bicycle. Her father, Graham Whitfield, had built a real estate development company that operated in 4 states. Her mother, Patricia, organized charity events with a specific kind of exhausting precision. They lived in a house in Greenwich, Connecticut that had a name. The property literally had a name, Elm Haven, the way only certain houses do. They were not unkind to me, the Whitfields. I want to be fair about that. When Landon brought me to meet them the following spring, a weekend visit that had the unmistakable quality of an audition, Patricia Whitfield served me tea and asked me careful, well-intentioned questions about Ohio in the way that certain people ask about Ohio. Graham shook my hand and said, Landon speaks very highly of you. Landon, standing beside his future father-in-law, smiled with a particular pride that I recognized. It was the pride of arrival, of having gotten somewhere. He was wearing a watch I had never seen before, slim and silver on his wrist. It probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. I smiled back. I drank my tea. I was polite in all the ways I had learned to be polite, but something shifted in me that weekend quietly, in a way I wouldn't fully name for another 2 years. Not jealousy. I was genuinely glad he had built this life. Not resentment. I had given what I gave freely. It was more like the particular sorrow of watching someone step into a life so new that there's no room for their previous one. Like watching someone change costumes completely and realize the old clothes no longer fit, so they simply don't put them back on. I drove back to Millhaven on Sunday afternoon. 6 hours in my car, which was 15 years old, and had developed a rattle in the passenger door that I'd been meaning to get looked at. I got home and I fed the cat that I had adopted the previous year. A gray tabby I called Chester, who was reliably present in ways that I had stopped expecting from people. And I made myself dinner and I didn't cry. I didn't cry because I was too tired, and also because I already understood on some level what was coming. They married in September. The wedding was at Elm Haven, on the lawn under white tents with flowers that Cassandra had chosen over a period of months, with a level of deliberation that suggested the flowers were very important. It was a beautiful event. Genuinely beautiful. I'm not being sarcastic. I wore the nicest dress I owned, which was a navy blue wrap dress I'd bought 2 years earlier on sale. And I did my own hair and my own makeup, and I sat at a table with Landon's college roommate and his wife. And I ate salmon and drank a glass of white wine and danced exactly once, when Landon found me near the end of the night and pulled me onto the dance floor for a song that was already half over. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said. "You look happy," I said. Because he did. I want to be clear about that. My son was genuinely happy that night, and there was a part of me, a large part, the deepest part, that was happy for him. Patricia Whitfield found me before I left. She held both my hands in hers and looked at me with an expression that was kind, but also slightly calibrated, the way certain acts of kindness are. "You must be so proud," she said. "I am," I said, and I meant it. The phone calls began spacing out after the wedding. Not immediately. The first year, they were still regular. But there was a new texture to them, a quality of performance, as if Landon were checking a box rather than making contact. He'd ask the right questions and give the right answers, and the call would end in exactly the right amount of time, and nothing would have actually been said. Then the calls started coming every other week, then monthly. Then there were the canceled visits. There were 5 over the course of 2 years. A Thanksgiving I had already bought food for, an Easter I had driven 2 hours for because we were meeting halfway, a weekend in August that simply got pushed back indefinitely until it disappeared entirely. Each time, there was a reason. A business trip, a prior commitment with Cassandra's family, something at work. All reasonable, all slightly too neat. What I noticed was that Landon's reasons were always delivered in a tone of slight irritation, as if my expectation of the visit was itself an imposition, as if the canceled thing were less of a loss for me and more of an inconvenience for him. I stopped voicing my disappointment after the 3rd canceled visit, not because I felt it less, but because I had begun to understand that voicing it only produced more of that tone, and I was too old and too tired to keep having conversations that made me feel I was being unreasonable for wanting my son to be present in my life. Dottie, who had never been particularly patient with Landon, even when he was a child, said to me once, "Evie, when did you start apologizing for needing something?" I didn't have a good answer. I moved into Willowbrook Senior Residence when I was 56, which is on the younger end for such places, but my knees had become a genuine problem, the left one especially, which had been protesting since my years on the concrete floor at the copy center, and had finally arrived at a point where climbing the stairs in my house several times a day was a project I was losing. The house was also expensive in the way old houses are, always needing something, always presenting me with a repair I couldn't easily afford. And the neighborhood had shifted, quietly, over the years, in ways that made evenings alone in it feel heavier than they used to. Willowbrook was clean and well-run, and the staff were, without exception, decent people. There were women there I liked. Eleanor Pace, who had been a high school English teacher for 30 years, and still argued about semicolons with a passion that I found completely charming. Ruth Ann Dwyer, who was 81 and funnier than most people I had ever met, and who had buried a husband and two of her three children and still found something to laugh about most afternoons. I fit there better than I expected to. I am not by nature a person who requires very much. I like books. I like a reasonable amount of conversation. I like the feeling of a day that has been organized, of things in their proper place. What I noticed, though, what it was impossible not to notice, was the phones. The way they did or didn't ring. Who came on Sundays, who didn't. The look that came over certain women's faces on holidays when they were the only one at their table with no one sitting across from them. I knew that look. I had practiced keeping it off my own face. I told Landon I had moved. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "That makes sense, Mom. I'm glad you'll have people around." As if I had done it for the company rather than because my knees wouldn't cooperate and I couldn't fix a furnace anymore. He didn't visit Willowbrook, not once in the 2.5 years I lived there. He intended to. I believe that. There were mentions of weekends that he was looking at, suggestions that he might drive out. But the drive was 4 hours from Chicago, which was not nothing, and there was always something. The last time I called him and he didn't answer, I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand and I looked out the window at the parking lot for a long time. Then I opened the drawer where I kept my stationery, a box of cream-colored paper with a small floral border that Dottie had given me 2 Christmases ago, and I took out a sheet of it and a pen. I thought for a while. Then I wrote the date at the top. Dear Landon, there are things I need you to know. I didn't write it all at once. That's important to understand. It wasn't a single evening's catharsis, a letter composed in one desperate sitting. I wrote it over months. I'd pick it up when something remembered itself. A detail that surfaced from 30 years ago, an image that came to me in the early morning when the residence was quiet and Chester was asleep on the end of the bed, and I was too awake to sleep and too tired to read. Some of what I wrote was simply the truth of what things had cost. The ring, the copy center, the 2 years of medical treatments I had managed around my work schedule and his college calendar, and kept so carefully from him that he had graduated without ever knowing his mother had spent 14 months in and out of oncology appointments. Some of it was memory. The time he was 6 and fell off his bicycle, the Huffy, the one he'd been resentful about, and split his chin open on the pavement, and I sat on the bathroom floor holding a towel to his face for 40 minutes while he screamed, and I told him stories to keep him calm, made-up stories about a dragon who was afraid of heights and a knight who was afraid of the dark, and by the time the bleeding stopped, he'd forgotten he was hurt because he wanted to know what happened to the dragon. Some of it was harder than that. Some of it I'm not going to describe because it was between him and me. But the last page, the last few lines, I spent a long time on those. Eleanor Pace, who had spent 30 years making students say what they actually meant, once told me, "The hardest thing to write is the thing that's completely true." I thought about that when I wrote the ending. I wanted it to be completely true, not kind in a way that wasn't honest, and not brutal in a way that served my anger instead of his understanding. I didn't write it to punish him. I need that to be clear. That wasn't what I was doing. I had been a mother for 35 years, and I had spent most of those years trying to protect this man from harder truths than he deserved to be shielded from. And maybe that was its own kind of mistake. Maybe all that careful protection had allowed him to grow in directions I hadn't anticipated. But the letter wasn't punishment. The letter was the truth. The whole truth, finally, without the management and the filters and the "I'm fine," Landon and the... Of course, that makes sense. I folded it. I sealed it. I wrote his name on the front in my regular handwriting, not the careful version, just the way I actually write. I gave it to my attorney, a quiet man named James Aldrin who had handled my modest affairs for 12 years, with instructions. After I was gone, this was to be delivered at the reading of my estate. There wasn't much of an estate. A small life insurance policy, Chester the cat, a box of photographs, a few pieces of furniture. Nothing that required a formal reading, really, but I wanted the formality. I wanted Landon to have to sit still and receive it. That's the one thing I will admit was deliberate, not cruel, deliberate. There's a difference. I wanted my son to have no choice but to be present for what I needed to say. because I had spent 35 years accommodating his choices to be somewhere else. The last months at Willowbrook were, strange as this might sound, not unhappy. I felt lighter. The letter was written. There's something that happens when you finally said the thing you needed to say, even if the person hasn't heard it yet, even if they won't hear it for some time. There's a loosening, a sense of having settled one's accounts. Eleanor and I played cards on Wednesday evenings. Ruth Ann told me a story about her late husband that made me laugh so hard I had to put my hand on the table to steady myself. The staff brought flowers every Monday for the common area. Simple things, grocery store carnations, nothing fancy, but they were there every Monday without fail, and I found I had a genuine affection for them. Landon called on my birthday. He was brief, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man sandwiched between things. He said he was thinking about visiting in the spring. I'd like that, I said. You doing okay, Mom? I'm doing fine, I said. Chester's been sleeping on my feet, which is annoying, but otherwise fine. He laughed at the cat, small, easy laughter, and for a moment he sounded like himself, the real version, the version I had known when he was young and unarmored, and I held on to that moment the way you hold on to things you know are ending. I love you, I said when we were wrapping up. There was the smallest pause, not long, just a beat. Love you too, Mom, he said. Then the call ended. I set my phone on the table. Chester was looking at me from the windowsill with the expression cats have when they can see through you. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, a few clouds moving across a pale sky. I picked up my book. I found my place. And I kept reading. The spring visit never happened. I want to say that clearly, without softening it, because I spent too long softening things in my own mind, and it didn't do me any good. Landon mentioned the spring visit in February, referenced it again in March with the vague language of someone who has not actually looked at a calendar, and then stopped mentioning it entirely sometime in April. By May, I had stopped waiting for it, which was its own kind of progress, I suppose. The progress of learning to stop expecting the thing that isn't coming. What came instead was a Tuesday afternoon phone call from Cassandra. That was unusual enough that I sat up straighter when I heard her voice. In 4 years of marriage to my son, Cassandra had called me independently exactly twice, once to confirm my dress color before the wedding so it wouldn't clash with the bridesmaids, and once to tell me that Landon had broken his wrist playing racquetball because he'd apparently asked her to call while he was being seen at urgent care. Both conversations had been brisk and functional, with the efficiency of someone completing an errand. This one was different. Evelyn, she said. She always called me Evelyn, never Mom, which I had long since decided not to interpret. I wanted to let you know that Landon and I have put an offer on a house in Greenwich. We're hoping to be moved in by the fall. That's wonderful, I said. Congratulations. It's near my parents, she said, and there was something in her voice, not quite apology, but the awareness that she was saying a thing that had a shape to it. Landon will be working from home part of the time, so it made sense to be closer to family. Closer to family. I held the phone against my ear and looked out my window at the parking lot. A woman I didn't know was loading grocery bags into a car. 3 bags. Methodical. One at a time. That sounds like a good decision, I said. We think so. A pause. I just wanted you to hear it from us directly. From us. As if Landon had authored this call when we both knew perfectly well he hadn't. This was Cassandra doing the thing she had learned to do over 4 years, managing the gap between what her husband should do and what he actually did, covering the distance with her own brisk competence. I thanked her for calling. She wished me well. The call lasted 6 minutes. After I hung up, I sat very still for a while. Then I got out my cream-colored stationery and I wrote another page. But I've thought about why I kept writing. It's a fair question. Fair to ask myself, I mean. At a certain point, I had said the essential things. The ring, the copy center, the illness, the years of 2 jobs and no savings and every choice made in his direction at the expense of my own. I could have sealed the letter after the first month, and it would have contained the truth. But writing, I discovered, is like pulling a thread. Once you begin, things surface that you didn't know were there, and some of those things surprised even me. I wrote about the time Landon was 14 and asked me for basketball shoes. A specific brand, expensive, the kind other boys had. I couldn't afford them. I told him so plainly, which was how I handled money conversations, because I thought honesty was better than evasion. He didn't throw a fit. He didn't argue. He just went quiet in a way that communicated his disappointment more effectively than any argument could have, and he wore the shoes I bought him. Reasonably priced, perfectly good shoes, with a specific kind of resignation that I felt every time I looked at his feet. 3 weeks later, I found out that he'd told a friend at school that his mother never got him anything. The friend's mother told me at a school event gently, with the careful expression of someone delivering information they feel you deserve to have. She thought I should know. She was right. I didn't confront Landon about it. I told myself he was 14 and 14-year-olds say things that aren't true. That it was embarrassment talking, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. All of that was probably partly true. But I also wondered, even then, what it meant that his instinct when he didn't get something he wanted was to erase what he had been given. I wrote about that. 2 full paragraphs, which took me 3 drafts to get right, because I wanted to be fair to the boy he was and honest about what I saw. Then I wrote about his college graduation, which he knew about. But then I wrote what he didn't know. The fever I'd been running for 4 days, the fact that I had taken 2 extra-strength ibuprofen in the car before I drove to Crestfield, the way my hands shook slightly during the ceremony that I kept pressing flat against my thighs so no one would see. I wrote about watching him walk across that stage and feeling something so large it didn't have a clean name. Pride and relief and love and exhaustion all compressed together into something that threatened to come out of me in a completely undignified way. And I held it in because I was not the story that day. He was. He should know he was held up by someone who was barely standing. That. Dottie came to Willowbrook every Thursday without fail. She would arrive at 2 o'clock with something she'd baked. Not always well. Dottie was an enthusiastic but imprecise baker. And we would sit in the common room or, if the weather allowed, outside on the small patio where there were metal chairs that were more comfortable than they looked. And we would talk about everything and nothing the way you can only do with someone you've known for 30 years. She knew about the letter. I had told her about it the previous winter, not in detail, but enough, that I was writing things down for Landon, things he didn't know, that it would go to him after I was gone. Dottie had opinions about this. "You could just tell him," she said one Thursday in June, picking apart a piece of lemon cake she had made that had come out slightly denser than intended. "I've tried telling him," I said. "No," she said, with the particular precision she reserved for moments when she thought I was being evasive. "You've tried not making him uncomfortable. That's different from telling him." She wasn't wrong. I knew she wasn't wrong, but I also knew myself well enough to know that if I called Landon and tried to say what was in those pages, one of 2 things would happen. Either he would become defensive, that particular retreat into the language of busy and overwhelmed, and I'd do my best that I had heard enough times to map its exact contours, or I would soften it. I would hear his voice, and I would see the 7-year-old and the 14-year-old and the boy in the blue graduation gown, and I would sand down the edges of the truth until it didn't cut anything. The letter wouldn't do that. The letter would just sit there on the page and be what it was. "I'm not doing it to hurt him," I told Dottie. "I know," she said. She picked up another piece of the too dense cake and ate it thoughtfully. "Does it matter, though? Whether you mean to hurt him?" I looked at her. "If the truth hurts," she said, "it hurts whether you meant it to or not." "Yes," I said. "That's the point." My health took a turn in late August. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of crisis, no emergency that announced itself. It was more like a gradual dimming. The knees had been bad for years, but other things began joining in. My stamina declined. I tired easily, in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a body that was beginning to economize. The nurses at Willowbrook noticed before I fully acknowledged it. Sandra, who did my weekly check-in and always smelled faintly of lavender, started sitting down when she talked to me rather than hovering in the doorway, which I understood as a professional signal. Dr. Okafor, who had been my physician since I moved to Willowbrook, sat across from me in his office in September and laid out some things plainly. He was a direct man, which I had always appreciated. He didn't dress things up. "Your heart is working harder than it should," he said. Combined with what we're already managing, the arthritis, the fatigue patterns, I think we need to talk honestly about what the next period looks like. All right, I said. Let's talk honestly. He did. I listened. I asked the questions I needed to ask and didn't ask the ones designed to produce more comfortable answers. When I left his office, I went back to my room and sat in my chair by the window, and I held Chester, who was an old cat by then and had developed a purr that rattled slightly on the exhale, like a small engine with a loose part. He settled against my chest and purred his rattling purr, and I held him and thought about what still needed to be said. The letter wasn't finished. There was one more thing. The thing I hadn't yet written was the hardest thing. The thing that sat at the center of everything and that I had been circling for months, adding pages around it without touching the center itself. I hadn't written about why I never asked him for anything, not once in 35 years. Not money, not presents, not recognition. People sometimes frame this as a virtue. Evelyn is so self-sufficient, people said. Evelyn never asks for anything. Even Dottie, who said hard things when they needed to be said, had a streak of admiration in her voice when she talked about it. But sitting in that chair with Chester rattling against my ribs, I understood it differently. I had never asked Landon for anything because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. Afraid that he would say no. Afraid that saying no would reveal something I wasn't prepared to see clearly. So instead of asking and risking the answer, I simply never asked. And then I told myself it was because I was strong and independent and didn't need anything. That wasn't strength. That was fear wearing strength's clothing. And the consequence of that fear was this. My son had been allowed to disappear from my life incrementally, one canceled visit at a time, one unanswered phone call at a time, without ever being asked to account for it. I had protected him from the discomfort of his own choices. I had managed the distance so quietly and efficiently that he could, in good conscience, tell himself I was fine, that I didn't need him, that I was happier this way. I had made it easy for him to leave me alone. I sat with that for a long time. It wasn't comfortable. I'm not going to pretend it was comfortable. Discovering at 58 years old that some portion of what had happened was a consequence of your own choices. That accountability runs in more than one direction. But it was true. And the letter was supposed to be the truth. So I wrote it, 2 pages, careful and plain. I didn't excuse him. So his choices were his choices, and I named them clearly. But I didn't position myself as only a victim either. I wrote about the fear. I wrote about what it had cost both of us, my silence. I wrote, I never asked you to choose me. I think that was my mistake, not just yours. You can't choose something you were never asked to choose. Eleanor Pace had a visitor in October, her youngest son, a man in his 50s who drove up from Indiana and stayed for 3 days. I watched them in the common room one afternoon. Not intrusively, just in the normal way you're aware of the people around you. He was showing her something on his phone, and she was squinting at the screen and laughing, and he had his hand on her arm with the casual ease of someone who touched this person regularly, who wasn't out of practice at it. Eleanor caught me watching and gave me a look that wasn't quite sympathy. She was too sharp for easy sympathy. Just an acknowledgement. A brief, clean recognition of what we were both seeing. I looked away. I picked up my book. That night I wrote the second-to-last page of the letter. I wrote about Eleanor's son and what it had looked like, and what I hoped Landon understood about the weight of that, about what it means to a person to be visited, to be found by their child in the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary week, to have someone show them something on a phone and laugh about it together. I wrote, it is not a large thing to be present. It only feels large when it becomes rare. Chester died on a Wednesday morning in November. He was found in his usual spot at the end of my bed, curled precisely, as if he had simply decided to stop in the middle of a nap. He was 15 years old, which is a full life for a cat. The vet Sandra called confirmed there was no distress. He had gone quietly, which was, she said, the best way. I buried him in the small garden behind Willowbrook, in a spot near the fence where the light came through in the afternoons. Eleanor helped me carry him out. Ruth Ann stood nearby and said nothing, which was exactly the right amount. Afterward, I went back to my room and I finished the letter. The last lines took me a long time. I wrote several versions. Too angry, too forgiving, too sad. Each version was true in some way and incomplete in another. I sat at my table as the afternoon moved across the floor and the light shifted, and finally I wrote the only version that felt completely true, that didn't tilt in any direction I couldn't stand behind. I'm not going to tell you what it said, not yet. That part belongs to Landon first, the way some things have to belong to the person they were written for before they can belong to anyone else. But I will say this. Writing it, the last line, I felt something release in my chest, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. And in the quiet of that November afternoon, in my small room at Willowbrook, with the empty spot at the end of the bed and the light going gray outside, I felt not happy, exactly. Not at peace in any grand sense, but settled. I had said what I needed to say. I folded the last page in with the others, sealed the envelope, wrote his name on the front in my ordinary handwriting, Landon, and brought it down the hall to the small safe where I kept the documents I'd given to James Aldrin's contact at the residence for safekeeping. Then I went to dinner. Ruth Ann was saving me a seat, which she did most evenings. She had gotten a piece of apple pie from somewhere and was guarding it with both hands. "Sit down," she said. "I told Margaret this piece was for you. She gave me a look." "Ruth Ann," I said, sitting down across from her, "you didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to. There's a difference." I looked at her. This 81-year-old woman who had lost more than most people do and still showed up to dinner and still saved pieces of pie for her friends. And I felt a sudden, uncomplicated gratitude that hit me somewhere behind the sternum. "Thank you," I said. She waved her fork. "Eat your pie before Margaret comes back." I ate my pie. It was good. Apples soft, crust a little uneven on one side, the way homemade things often are. The dining room was warm and loud with other people's conversations, and for a little while I just sat there in the middle of it all and let it be exactly what it was. Evelyn Harper died on a Thursday morning in February at 6:42 a.m. in her room at Willowbrook Senior Residence. Sandra found her. That detail matters to me, that it was Sandra who smelled of lavender and had started sitting down when she talked to my mother rather than hovering in the doorway. Sandra, who had known something was shifting before anyone said it plainly. Sandra told me later, when I finally drove out to Willowbrook 3 days after the funeral arrangements had already been made by James Aldrin's office because I hadn't known to make them myself, that my mother had been peaceful, that the room was tidy, that the book on her nightstand was marked with a receipt from the Willowbrook cafeteria 3/4 of the way through. She had been reading the night before. She had gone to sleep. She hadn't woken up. "She talked about you," Sandra said. "We were standing in the hallway outside what had been my mother's room. The door was open. The bed had been stripped. A lot of the residents, their families visit, so we know them, but your mother talked about you enough that I felt like I knew you too." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. I had gotten the call on a Thursday morning. I was in the middle of a client breakfast at a restaurant in Greenwich, the kind of restaurant with cloth napkins and a noise level calibrated to suggest exclusivity without outright quiet. My phone was on the table, face down, the way I kept it during client meetings, because Cassandra said it looked more professional. I flipped it over when I felt it vibrate and saw a number I didn't immediately recognize with an Ohio area code, and I let it go to voicemail because I was mid-sentence about Q3 projections. I listened to the voicemail 12 minutes later, standing outside the restaurant on a gray February sidewalk, and the world did that thing it does sometimes where it continues exactly as it was. A woman walking a dog, a delivery truck idling at the light, steam rising from a grate in the pavement, while something inside you rearranges itself into a completely different configuration. I drove home. I told Cassandra. She held my hand and said the right things, because Cassandra was good at saying the right things, and I sat on the edge of our bed in the house near Greenwich that we had bought partly to be closer to her family, and I thought, I have not seen my mother in 2 years and 3 months. I knew the number. I had known it for a while, in the way you know things you don't let yourself look at directly. 2 years and 3 months. The funeral was small. James Aldrin had handled the arrangements according to instructions my mother had apparently left with him, which should not have surprised me, because of course she had left instructions. Of course she had organized her own exit with the same methodical care she applied to everything. But it did surprise me. It surprised me that she had planned it without any expectation that I would plan it, which meant she had understood something about me that I had not yet understood about myself. Dottie Marsh was there. I recognized her from a photograph my mother had sent me years ago. A compact woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who has decided not to take up any less space than she's entitled to. She looked at me when I walked in, and the look she gave me was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was the look of someone who knew things. Eleanor Pace was there, thinner than I expected, with a younger man beside her who I understood to be her son. Ruth Ann Dwyer sat in the second row with a cane I suspected she didn't always use, wearing a bright red coat that felt somehow completely right. Several women from Willowbrook whom I didn't know. Sandra, in the back, in her regular clothes. Nobody from my life was there. My life had not overlapped with my mother's in long enough that the two worlds had fully separated. I sat in the front row. Cassandra was beside me, her hand over mine. The service was simple. My mother had not wanted elaborate, James Aldrin told me afterward. She had been very clear about that. Someone read a poem. There was music, a piece of piano I didn't recognize, but that felt like her somehow. Unhurried, a little melancholic, but not without brightness. I did not cry during the service. I don't entirely know why. I think I was still in the stage of processing where the facts are present, but the feelings are somewhere slightly behind them, like luggage on a slow conveyor belt. The fact of her death was there. The feeling of it was still on its way. Dottie found me outside afterward. "You should know," she said, without preamble, "that your mother never said a single negative word about you to anyone at that residence. Not to me, not to the staff, not to anyone." I looked at her. "People asked," Dottie said, "because people notice when someone doesn't have visitors. They'd ask about you, and she would talk about your job, your house, how well you were doing. She paused, her jaw working slightly. She was proud of you, constantly, completely. It was the most—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Then she looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "She deserved better than what she got. I want you to know I think that, but I also want you to know that she didn't spend her time thinking that. She was your mother until the end of it." She walked away before I could respond, which was probably intentional because there was nothing I could have said that wouldn't have been inadequate. James Aldrin's office was on the second floor of a building in downtown Millhaven that smelled of old carpet and copying paper. He was a small, precise man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the deliberate manner of someone who had delivered difficult information many times and had learned to do it without unnecessary ceremony. He called 2 weeks after the funeral and asked me to come in. I drove out on a Saturday. Cassandra offered to come. I said I was fine, which was something I had said so many times in recent weeks that it had lost most of its meaning. "There is very little in the way of traditional estate," James Aldrin said once we were seated. He had a folder in front of him, thin, nothing like what the word estate usually implies. "A modest life insurance policy, which names you as the sole beneficiary. Some personal effects that have been boxed and are being held at Willowbrook for your collection. And this." He slid an envelope across the desk. Cream-colored. A small floral border. My name on the front in my mother's handwriting. Not her careful handwriting, the version she used for formal things, but her regular handwriting. The handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists she used to leave on the refrigerator door. Landon. "She left specific instructions," James Aldrin said. "This was to be delivered at the reading of the estate, in your presence, by me. Not mailed, not left with your effects. Delivered." He looked at me steadily over his reading glasses. She was very specific. I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Not heavy like a brick, heavy like something that contained more than a single sheet of paper. "Would you like privacy?" he asked. "No," I said. Then, "Yes. Actually, yes. Thank you." He excused himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned when to leave a room. I sat alone in his office with the envelope in my hands for a long moment. Outside the window, Millhaven went about its Saturday. A car passed. Someone was shoveling a walkway across the street, methodical, left to right. I opened the envelope. The first page was dated over a year ago. She had been writing this for over a year. I understood that before I understood anything else, the scope of it. She had not sat down one afternoon in a wave of feeling and written me a letter. She had written this the way she did everything, carefully, over time, with revision. She had meant every word. I read. The first pages were the ones I could handle. Memory. Stories I half remembered or remembered differently. The birthday where she'd made a cake from a mix that had come out slightly lopsided, and she'd decorated it so elaborately that the lopsidedness didn't matter until I was older and saw a photograph and understood. The summer I was 9 and had wanted to go to a camp that cost money she didn't have, and instead she had taken 2 days off work and driven me to a state park 3 hours away, and we had camped in a tent she borrowed from someone at Hartley's, and it had rained the second night, and we'd sat in the car eating crackers and listening to the radio. I had forgotten that, completely. The camp I wanted and didn't get, I remembered. The trip she improvised, I had no memory of it whatsoever until I read the page. The second section was harder. She wrote about the ring. A simple sentence. I sold my wedding ring in your second year at Crestfield to pay for the transmission repair and put the rest toward your tuition. I want you to know that, not because I want you to feel bad about it, but because I want you to know what things actually cost. I put the page down on James Aldrin's desk. I looked at the wall. There was a framed print of a landscape, a river, some trees, generic and inoffensive. I looked at it for a while. Then I picked the page back up and kept reading. The Copy Center. 3 evenings a week. 11 years at Hartley's. I knew she had worked hard. Of course I knew she had worked hard. I wasn't stupid. I had grown up in that house, and I knew we didn't have money. But knowing it in the abstract way of a child and seeing it laid out in plain, specific sentences were two completely different things. She wrote about the concrete floor. She wrote about her feet. She wrote it without melodrama, which somehow made it worse than melodrama. Just the facts of it, put down plainly, the way you write things when you want them to be clear. Then I turned to the page about her illness. I had to read that paragraph 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. Breast cancer. Early stage, treatable. She said that, she was careful to say it, as if even in a letter she was still managing my reaction. 14 months of treatment scheduled around my college calendar. Appointments on Tuesdays, her day off. Being sick on Tuesday evenings and Wednesday mornings, and pressing herself back into shape by Wednesday afternoon because she had a shift at 3. She had been in cancer treatment for 14 months while I was finishing my degree at Crestfield. I had called her every Sunday, and she had said, "Everything is fine, Landon." She had sat in those bleachers on graduation day with a fever she had been managing for 4 days, and she had clapped until her hands hurt, and I had found her in the crowd and said, "You look tired, Mom. You look tired." And she had said, "I've been busy. Go celebrate with your friends." I put the letter down on the desk and I pressed both hands flat against the surface, and I breathed. Just breathed. The kind of deliberate breathing you do when you understand that the alternative is something you can't take back in a lawyer's office on a Saturday morning. 35 years. I had been working backward through 35 years as I sat in that room, and each page was adding weight to a number I thought I understood and didn't understand at all. The middle sections of the letter were the ones that didn't let me look away. She wrote about the phone calls. She was precise about it in a way that took something out of me. She hadn't kept a log. She was clear about that. She wasn't documenting grievances in a ledger. But she had a specific kind of memory that remembered patterns, the shape of time, the way things added up. She wrote about watching her phone ring on her end without being answered. She wrote about the canceled visits with a restraint that was somehow more devastating than anger. She named them without commentary, just the dates and the plans that had existed and then hadn't. Thanksgiving, Easter, the August weekend. She wrote about the move to Willowbrook, the real reasons, the knees and the house, and the weight of evenings alone. And then she wrote what I had told myself, which was that she was probably happier having people around her. She wrote, "I know you told yourself that. I want you to understand that I never told you it was true." She wrote about the 2 years and 3 months, not as accusation. I want to be clear about that because I've thought about it many times since. There was no accusation in her language. She was past accusation by the time she was writing it. What there was instead was something that hit harder than accusation. Simple description. She described those 2 years from the inside. The Wednesday card games with Eleanor and Ruth Ann. The Thursday afternoons with Dottie. The way she had watched other women's children visit and learned very precisely how to be present in a room when what you feel is absence. She wrote, "I got quite good at it. That is not something a mother should have to get good at." I read that sentence and something cracked open in me that I hadn't even known was sealed. She wrote about herself, her fear, that she had never asked me for anything because she was afraid of what my answer would be, and that she understood now that this had been a mistake, that love doesn't work without risk, without asking, without the chance of the wrong answer. She wrote, "I protected you from having to choose me, and in doing so, I made the choosing easier to avoid. I don't know whether to be angry at you or at myself. I have decided to just be honest instead." She had decided to be honest instead. By the time I reached the final pages, I had lost track of how long I had been sitting there. The Saturday sounds outside the window had not changed. Still cars, still ordinary Millhaven going about its day, but they felt very far away. I was in a different place. I was 35 years back, and I was looking at things I had not looked at and had not wanted to look at. The final page. The handwriting was slightly different on the last page. Not worse, just slower. She had taken her time. Every word was placed deliberately. She wrote about Chester, who had died in November and was buried near the fence where the afternoon light came through. She wrote about Eleanor Pace's son and what it had looked like from across the common room, a thing so simple it should have required no comment, a mother and her son looking at something on a phone together and laughing. She wrote, "I watched them, and I did not feel sorry for myself. I felt sorry that you did not know what you were missing. That seems like the more important loss." She wrote about the last phone call. She wrote what she had heard in my voice, the quality of performance, the box checking, the way I said "I love you" at the end with that smallest pause. She wrote, "I heard it. I always heard everything. I just stopped saying so." And then the last lines. I will only tell you what they said because she wrote them for me to carry, and I think some weight is supposed to be carried, not locked away. She wrote, "I never blamed you for becoming who you became. The hunger in you started very young, and I watched it, and I didn't always handle it correctly. But I need you to understand what was built under you, so that you can understand what you were standing on, not to make you feel small, so that you know how to stand correctly from here. I forgive you. That is not nothing, but forgiveness is between you and me. What you do next is between you and who you want to be. I never stopped loving you. I only stopped waiting for you to come home." I don't know how long I sat there after I finished reading. Long enough that James Aldrin knocked softly on the door and asked if I needed anything. I told him no. He went away again. The letter was in my hands. All of it, every page, 12 pages in my mother's handwriting. 12 pages of everything she had managed and protected and quietly carried for 35 years, laid out in cream-colored paper with a small floral border that Dottie Marsh had given her 2 Christmases ago. She had used the nice stationery. I thought about that she had used the nice stationery, saved for things that mattered, and that she had decided this was the thing that mattered most. More than any birthday card, any holiday note, this. I thought about the 14 months of treatment she had kept from me, and I thought about the graduation ceremony in the sun, and I thought about "You look tired, Mom," and I thought about the phone I had watched ring on the table at the restaurant while I talked about Q3 projections, and I thought about 2 years and 3 months, and I thought about the apartment in Greenwich that was near Cassandra's family because we wanted to be close to family, and I thought about Eleanor Pace's son, the hand on her arm, the phone screen, the laughter. And I thought about my mother eating apple pie that Ruth Ann Dwyer had saved for her in a dining room full of other people's voices, because Ruth Ann had wanted to, and there was a difference between wanting to and having to. I sat with all of that. The success I had spent 15 years building, the title, the house, the watch, the restaurant with the cloth napkins, it didn't feel like nothing, exactly. It felt like what it was, real things that I had earned and that had genuine value. But sitting in that room with 12 pages of cream-colored paper in my hands, they were the wrong size. Everything I had assembled felt slightly off scale against what I was holding. My mother had never asked me for anything, not once. And in the end, she hadn't asked for anything in the letter either. She hadn't asked for guilt, hadn't asked for penance, hadn't asked for a particular response. She had only asked me to know to finally, completely know. I folded the letter carefully, the way it had been folded when I opened it. I put it back in the envelope. I held the envelope in my lap, and I sat in James Aldrin's office with its generic landscape print and its carpet smell. And for the first time since that Thursday morning phone call outside the restaurant, the luggage finally arrived. The feeling caught up with the facts. And what came out of me, quietly, in that room alone on a Saturday morning in February, was not dramatic enough for what it was. Just a man sitting in a chair with a letter, crying the way people cry when they understand that the chance they should have taken is gone, and that no amount of success, no number of correct professional decisions, no house in Greenwich is going to give it back. My mother was gone. The letter was 12 pages long, and not a single page of it had asked me for anything except the truth of what it had cost her to love me. That was the most expensive thing I had ever been given. I drove back to Greenwich that same Saturday with the letter on the passenger seat. Not in my bag, not in the back. On the seat beside me, in its cream-colored envelope, where I could see it in my peripheral vision for the entire 4-hour drive. I don't know exactly why I did that. Some instinct that it shouldn't be put away yet, that I wasn't finished being in the presence of it. Cassandra was home when I arrived. She heard the door and came out of the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand and looked at my face and said, "Come sit down." She poured me something to drink and sat across from me at the kitchen table and waited. Cassandra was good at waiting when she understood the situation required it. It was one of the things I had always valued in her. That competence, that ability to read a room and calibrate accordingly. "She wrote me a letter," I said. 12 pages. Cassandra nodded. "She was sick," I said. "When I was finishing college. Cancer. She went through treatment for over a year, and she never told me." Cassandra was quiet. "She sold her wedding ring," I said, "to pay for a car repair and put the rest toward my tuition." I watched Cassandra's face move through something, a small, precise reckoning that she kept mostly contained. She set down her glass. "Landon, I haven't seen her in 2 years and 3 months," I said. I knew that number. I hadn't let myself look at it directly. There was a silence between us that had weight, not hostile, just honest, which was its own kind of uncomfortable. "What do you need?" Cassandra asked. "I don't know yet," I said, and that was the truest thing I had said in a very long time. The guilt came in waves, which is not a poetic description, but an accurate one. It wasn't constant. It would recede for stretches of hours, sometimes almost a full day, and I would function normally, eat meals, answer emails, sit in meetings, and then something would surface it. A Tuesday. The smell of copy paper. A woman about my mother's age walking across a parking lot alone. And then the wave would be back, and it was larger than I expected each time, because grief and guilt together are not additive. They are multiplicative, each one amplifying the other until the combined weight becomes something you have to physically manage. I was not good at managing it, and I want to say that plainly because I think there's a version of this story where I handle the aftermath with some kind of quiet dignity, and I don't want to tell that version. The truth is messier. I was short with Cassandra over things that had nothing to do with her. I woke up at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark doing arithmetic. The 14 months, the 3 evenings a week at the copy center, the ring, the 4 days of fever at graduation, as if calculating the exact sum would produce something useful, which it didn't. I went back to work too quickly and then found myself sitting in my office, unable to account for 20 minutes that had passed while I was looking at nothing. Cassandra said, one evening in early March, with the careful tone of someone who has been holding something for a while, "Have you thought about talking to someone?" "I'm talking to you," I said. "You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I was not opposed to it in principle. I was opposed to sitting in a room and articulating the specific shape of what I had done, because articulating it made it more real, and it was already real enough. It was taking up most of the available space in my interior life. "Not yet," I said. She didn't push. But the question stayed in the room after that, the way questions do when they've been asked honestly. What I did instead, what I found myself doing almost without deciding to, was going back. Not to Willowbrook immediately. First, I called Dottie Marsh. She picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. I had half expected her not to answer. She had made her position on me fairly clear outside the funeral home, and Dottie Marsh did not seem like a woman who changed positions casually. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "I need to ask you some things," I said. "About my mother. About the last few years." A pause. "All right. Come to Millhaven. I'm not doing this on the phone." I drove out the following Saturday. Dottie lived in a house on the east side of Millhaven, a small two-story with a front porch and a yard that had clearly been the project of someone with opinions about garden organization. She met me at the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked at me the same way she had outside the funeral home, sharp, measuring, not unkind, but not easy. "Coffee," she said. It was not a question. We sat at her kitchen table. It was the kind of kitchen that had been used seriously for many years. Slightly worn countertops, a collection of mugs that didn't match, a window above the sink with actual plants in it that were actually alive. My mother would have liked this kitchen, I thought. And then I thought, of course she would have. She spent 30 years here. "Tell me what you want to know," Dottie said. "Everything," I said. "Whatever you're willing to tell me." She studied me for a moment. Then she wrapped both hands around her mug and she began to talk. Bussin'. She talked for almost 2 hours. That should tell you something about how much there was to say and how long it had been waiting to be said to the right person. She told me about the copy center. Not that my mother had worked there, I knew that from the letter, but what it had looked like. Dottie had driven her there once when my mother's car was in the shop, had sat outside for 20 minutes waiting, had watched my mother come out the front door at 10:15 at night with the particular careful movement of someone whose feet were protesting every step. "She saw me watching her," Dottie said, "and she straightened up, just pulled herself up and walked normally, like if she moved right I wouldn't notice. That was your mother. She couldn't help it. She told me about the medical treatments. She had driven my mother to 2 of the appointments. She talked the whole way there," Dottie said, "about everything except where we were going, the weather, a book she was reading, something she'd heard on the radio. I almost asked her to stop once because the talking was making me more nervous than silence would have. But then I thought, this is how she's doing it. This is how she gets through the door. So I let her talk." "Did she—" I stopped. Started again. "Was she scared?" Dottie looked at me. "Landon, she was terrified." She said it simply, no hesitation. She was a person. Of course she was scared. She just didn't have anyone she could be scared in front of because the one person she would have told was the one person she'd decided not to tell. That landed exactly where it was supposed to land. "She never complained about you," Dottie said. "I want to be fair about that, because I know I was hard on you outside the church. She defended you. Every single time someone at Willowbrook made a comment, and people did make comments because people notice things, she would shut it down. She'd say you were busy, that you had a demanding job, that she was fine. She meant it mostly. But also," Dottie paused, turning her mug in a slow circle, "I knew her well enough to hear the gap between what she said and what she felt. She was proud of you and she missed you, and those two things lived in her simultaneously every single day, and she never asked you to resolve that for her." I sat with that. Why didn't she just say so? The question came out smaller than I intended, almost like a child asking it. Dottie looked at me steadily. "Because you made it clear, not in words, that the answer would be inconvenient. People learn, Landon. When someone you love keeps not answering, keeps postponing, keeps being unavailable, eventually you learn not to ask. It's not weakness. It's just, you learn what the situation is." I went to Willowbrook the following week. I don't entirely know what I was looking for. Some version of her, maybe. Some residue of the 2.5 years she had spent there that I had never witnessed and could not now witness firsthand. I signed in at the front desk, and the woman there recognized my name in a way that suggested she had been waiting for me to appear. Eventually, the way people in small communities wait for things that have been long expected. Sandra met me in the hallway outside my mother's old room. The door was open. A new resident had moved in. I could see through the doorway, a few different pieces of furniture, a different arrangement entirely, the room already becoming someone else's. "Thank you for seeing me," I said. Of course. Sandra's expression was the same quiet, professional warmth I remembered from the day she'd told me about the book on the nightstand. I meant what I said. She talked about you a lot. What did she say? Sandra thought about it for a moment. She said you were analytical, that you solved problems the way other people read, constantly, automatically. She said you got that from her, but you'd taken it further than she had. A small pause. She said she hoped you'd eventually turn it on the right problems. I stood in that hallway and heard that, and felt the particular sensation of being understood by someone who was no longer there to tell directly. Sandra walked me through the common room, the dining area, the small patio outside where my mother had sat on Thursday afternoons with Dottie when the weather allowed. I saw the garden near the fence where Chester was buried, the spot my mother had written about. The afternoon light came through exactly as she'd described. I stood there for a while. Then Sandra introduced me to Ruth Ann Dwyer, who was sitting in the common room with a crossword puzzle and the air of someone who had correctly predicted this visit. Sit down, Ruth Ann said without looking up from her puzzle. I've been wanting to talk to you. Mrs. Dwyer, Ruth Ann. She looked up then, and she had the same quality Dottie had. Eyes that didn't perform softness they didn't feel, that looked at you directly and expected the same. Your mother saved me a piece of pie once. Did you know that? I'd brought it from my daughter's house, homemade, and I was going to eat the whole thing myself, and your mother caught me eyeing it, and I told her to help herself. She said, no, it's yours. I said I'd give her half. She said, fine. Ruth Ann smiled, a small one. She ate half that pie and said it was the best pie she'd had in a long time. I asked her when she'd last had homemade pie. She thought about it and said she couldn't remember. I didn't say anything. She ate alone a lot, Ruth Ann said directly. Not always, but a lot. The thing about this place is that people's families visit on different schedules, and you get a sense of who has regulars and who doesn't. Your mother didn't have regulars, but she never acted like it was a problem. She always seemed, Ruth Ann paused, choosing arranged, like she'd arranged herself so that the empty space didn't show. Very few people can do that convincingly. Your mother could. Did she ever... I stopped. Say she was lonely? Ruth Ann completed the thought without apology. Not out loud, but one evening, it was getting late, most people had gone back to their rooms, and it was just me and Eleanor and your mother at the table. And Eleanor asked her, out of nowhere the way Eleanor sometimes did things, she said, Evelyn, what do you miss most? And your mother sat there for a minute, and she said, Sunday mornings. When he was small, Sunday mornings we'd stay in pajamas until noon, and he'd watch cartoons on the floor, and I'd read on the couch, and we didn't have to be anywhere. Those mornings were just ours. Ruth Ann set her crossword puzzle on the table. Then she picked up her book, and that was that. She didn't say anything else about it. Ruth Ann looked at me with those direct, weathered eyes. You were the Sunday mornings, son. That's what she missed. I went home and I sat in my study, and I did not go to work the next day. I called in and said I needed personal time, and my assistant said, Of course. And that was that. The machinery of my professional life continuing without me for a day, which it did effortlessly, which told me something about what I had believed about my own indispensability. I took the letter out again. I read it again, all 12 pages, this time with Dottie's voice in my ear and Sandra's words and Ruth Ann's story about the Sunday mornings. It was a different experience the second time, not less painful, but more specific. Less about the abstraction of guilt and more about the concrete particular shape of what had been lost. Not just years, not just visits. Specific things. Sunday mornings, the other half of a piece of pie. The book on the nightstand marked 3/4 through with a cafeteria receipt. Cassandra knocked on the door of my study that evening and came in without waiting. She sat in the chair across from my desk, the one where clients sometimes sat, and looked at me. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking about what she did with 35 years, I said. What she built for me and what I did with what she built. Cassandra was quiet. I have a good life, I said. I'm not going to pretend I don't, but I've been building it like it had no foundation, like it started with me, like everything underneath was just background. I stopped. She wasn't background. No, Cassandra said. She wasn't. A silence. Outside the window, the Greenwich evening was doing what Greenwich evenings did. Quiet, ordered, comfortable in all the ways my mother's evenings had not been comfortable. I want to do something, I said, not to fix it. I know it's not fixable, but something that matters, Cassandra said. Yes. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. I should have pushed you harder, to visit, to call. I noticed it, and I told myself it wasn't my place, and I should have decided it was my place because it mattered. She said it steadily, without drama, the way Cassandra did hard things. I'm telling you that because if we're doing this, I'm doing it with you, and I don't want to start it with something I should have already said. I looked at my wife across my desk in my study in the house near her parents', and I understood that accountability was happening in more than one direction, the way my mother had written it, that it moved through everyone, not just me. Okay, I said. Okay, she said. Boss, what followed was not a transformation. I want to be exact about this because transformations are clean, and what happened to me in the months after my mother's death was not clean. It was slow and uncomfortable, and included several weeks of talking to a therapist named Dr. Whitmore, who had the exhausting quality of asking questions that seemed simple until you tried to answer them. It included long conversations with Cassandra that did not always end well. It included driving to Millhaven 3 times in 4 months, which was more than I had driven there in the previous 5 years. Each time learning something new from Dottie or from Sandra or from Ruth Ann, each time adding a dimension to the picture of a woman I had thought I knew. What I found in all of those conversations was something I had not expected to find. She had not been bitter. This was the thing that undid me more than anything else, more than the ring or the cancer or the 2 years and 3 months. The women who knew her described someone who was sad, sometimes, and lonely in the way she had managed not to show directly, but not bitter, not corroded by what had happened. She had loved me with the whole of it, the real kind, the kind that doesn't make conditions and doesn't keep score even when it should. I did not deserve that quality of love. I'm not being self-flagellating when I say that. I'm just being accurate. What she gave me was more than I had earned, and I had spent a long time not examining that gap. Examining it now was painful in the specific way of understanding that something irreplaceable has been handled carelessly. But I also understood something else, something she had written on the second-to-last page, the thing about accountability running in both directions. My mother had not been only a saint. She had been a person who made choices, some of them driven by fear, some of them driven by love, some of them both at once. She had chosen not to ask. She had chosen not to make me uncomfortable, and in doing so had made it easy for me to stay comfortable. We had both participated in the arrangement that left her alone. Understanding that didn't excuse me, but it gave me something to work with that pure guilt couldn't give. A map, an understanding of how the road had actually run, so that I could think about roads going forward. I sold the watch first. The slim silver one I'd been wearing since before the wedding, the one I'd had on my wrist the afternoon I took my mother to meet the Whitfields. It was worth considerably more than I had paid for it, which is how those things work, and I put the money in a separate account. Then the car. I had 2, a practical one and a less practical one that I had bought during a period of professional acceleration when buying it had felt like a marker of having arrived somewhere. I sold the less practical one, more into the account. Cassandra watched this process without interference. She had said she was in it with me, and she meant it, but she was also, fairly, watching to understand what it was going to be before she committed to the specific shape of it. I had an idea. It had come to me the second time I visited Willowbrook, standing in the common room and watching an elderly man in the corner who had been there both times I'd visited, sitting in the same chair, doing approximately the same thing, and who no one had come to see on either occasion. I had watched him, and I had thought about Ruth Ann saving pie, about Eleanor's son, and the hand on the arm, the phone screen, the laugh, about what it cost to be forgotten, and whether cost is the right word for what it actually is, which is more like erosion. Being forgotten erodes you, slowly, quietly, the way water takes stone. I started making calls, not to people I knew professionally, to people who knew things I didn't, Nonprofit attorneys, social workers, people who ran senior care programs in underfunded counties. I asked questions with the same analytical instinct my mother had told Sandra about, constantly, automatically, turning it on the right problems at last. What I found was not surprising, but was still striking. The loneliness epidemic among elderly adults was documented, measured, studied, and massively underfunded. The gap between what existed and what was needed was enormous. Not dramatic enormous in a way that announced itself, quiet enormous in the way of things that happen to people who don't have loud advocates. I thought about my mother arranging herself so the empty space didn't show. I thought about the Sunday mornings. I incorporated the foundation in April, 4 months after reading the letter. I named it Harper Family Outreach, her name, her word, her framing, not a monument, a function, something that would do the work she had deserved to have done for her. Dottie, when I told her, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't do it for her. She doesn't need it. Do it for the ones who are still in those chairs." "I know," I said. "Do you?" she asked. Not unkindly, just making sure. "I'm learning," I said. She accepted that, which was, from Dottie Marsh, the closest thing to approval I was going to get, and I understood that and did not push for more. I drove home from Millhaven that evening with the windows down despite the cold, a thing my mother used to do. I had remembered it suddenly. She would roll the windows down in early spring even when it was still technically too cold, because she said the cold air meant the winter was ending and she wanted to feel that. And I drove through the darkening Ohio countryside with the cold air moving through the car, and I let myself feel the particular sorrow of the lesson learned too late, and the particular clarity of knowing exactly what came next. She had told me I wasn't standing correctly. She had told me what the foundation was. She had written 12 pages so I would know. I intended to stand correctly from now on, not because it would give me anything back, because it was the only honest thing left to do with everything she had given me. The Harper Family Outreach Center opened on a Wednesday morning in October, 14 months after Landon read his mother's letter in James Aldrin's office. It was not a grand opening. Landon had been specific about that. No ribbon cutting, no catered reception, no press release designed to make the donor look generous. What he wanted and what he got was a Tuesday afternoon walkthrough with the staff, a Wednesday morning where the doors simply opened, and a group of 7 elderly residents from 2 different senior facilities in the Millhaven area who came in and sat down and were offered coffee and someone to talk to. The building itself was a converted community space on the east side of Millhaven. Not beautiful, not modern, but solid and well-maintained with large windows that let the October light in at a low angle that made the common room feel warmer than the temperature warranted. There were comfortable chairs, bookshelves with actual books on them, not decoration. A small kitchen where volunteers could make real food, not institutional food. A garden in the back, still being developed, that one of the staff members, a woman named Pauline, who had spent 20 years as a social worker and had opinions about everything, had declared would have a section with afternoon light coming through near the fence. Landon had not said anything when Pauline described the garden plan. He had just nodded and written down the additional budget she needed. Dottie Marsh came on opening day. She arrived at 10 in the morning in her flannel shirt and her reading glasses on top of her head, and she stood in the middle of the common room and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything with the careful assessment of someone who was not going to say it was good until she was sure it was good. Landon waited. "The chairs are right," she said finally. "Nothing worse than chairs that look comfortable and aren't. Your mother had a chair at Willowbrook that she loved because it was actually comfortable, not just styled to look that way. She sat in it every evening." She paused. "These are right. I sat in about 30 chairs before I ordered those," Landon said. Dottie looked at him with a slight shift in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the softening of the sharpness. Just slightly. "She would have done the same thing," she said. Then she went and poured herself a coffee and started talking to Pauline, and that was the extent of the ceremony. Ruth Ann Dwyer came 2 weeks later with her cane and her red coat and sat in one of the chairs for 2 hours and talked to 3 different people and told Landon on her way out that the coffee was better than Willowbrook's, which he should tell no one because she didn't want to start something. The first year was hard in ways Landon had not anticipated and should have. Running a nonprofit is not like running a financial consulting practice. The skills overlapped less than he had expected. He was good at the structural things, the budgets, the board meetings, the grant applications that required someone who understood how to build a financial argument. He was less good at the parts that required a different kind of presence, a willingness to sit with people without agenda, without the forward motion of professional purpose. Several times in that first year, Pauline looked at him in a way that communicated, without words, that he was being efficient when the situation called for something else. "You don't have to fix everything," she told him once, after he had spent an afternoon problem-solving logistics with a volunteer coordinator who had actually come to him with something simpler, a need to feel that someone was listening. Sometimes people don't need a solution. They need someone to be in the room with them. Landon heard that differently than Pauline intended it. Or rather, he heard it the way she intended it, and he also heard his mother underneath it. It is not a large thing to be present. It only feels large when it becomes rare. He was learning to be present. He was not naturally good at it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, and that imperfection mattered. It meant the learning was real. Cassandra came to Millhaven with him most weeks by the second year. She had her own professional work. She had taken on a consulting role with a nonprofit housing organization that suited her particular competencies. But she built the drive to Millhaven into her week with the same brisk commitment she applied to everything she decided mattered. She was better with the residents than Landon was, initially. She had a quality of attentive patience that he had always admired and was only now understanding the full depth of. There was a woman at the center named Agnes, 83, a former piano teacher with arthritis in her hands that had taken the plane from her 15 years ago and left a specific kind of grief that she carried quietly. Agnes had a son in Portland who called on birthdays and a daughter in Florida who sent cards at Christmas and visited every other year. And in between those contacts, Agnes existed in a space of profound, ordinary invisibility that she had learned to navigate because there was no alternative. Landon sat with Agnes on a Thursday afternoon in the center's second year. They were in the common room, and she was looking out the window at the garden where Pauline's plantings had come in, not fully yet, but enough. Some late-season color, the fence with the afternoon light coming through the way Pauline had planned. "Your mother was here?" Agnes asked. She knew the story. Most people at the center did, in the way things circulate in small communities. Not all the details, but the shape of it. "Not here," Landon said. "At Willowbrook, about a mile from here." Agnes nodded. "And she never told you she needed anything?" "She didn't." Agnes was quiet, watching the garden. "My daughter calls it independence," she said, "when I don't ask for things. She says, 'Mom, you're so independent,' and I smile and I say, 'Yes, I suppose I am.'" She turned from the window to look at Landon directly. "But the truth is, after a certain number of times of reaching and not finding anyone there, you stop reaching. You call it independence because that feels better than the other word." Landon sat with that. "You're here now," Agnes said. "Not as consolation, just as a fact." "I'm here now," he agreed. "That's not nothing," she said. Then she looked back at the garden. "It's not everything either, but it's not nothing." He kept the letter in his desk at home. Not the copy center made. He had not made copies, had not photographed it, had not done anything to replicate or distribute it. The original 12 pages, in the cream-colored envelope with the floral border, with his name on the front in his mother's ordinary handwriting. He read it again on the anniversary of her death. The first anniversary he read all 12 pages. The second he read only the last. The third he sat with the envelope in his hands for a long time and did not open it, and understood that this was its own kind of progress, not because the contents had lost their weight, but because he had found a way to carry the weight that didn't require constant re-examination. He knew what it said. He was trying to live in response to it. What the letter had given him, he understood now, was not guilt, or not only guilt. What it had given him was a complete picture. Most people go through their lives knowing their parents partially, through the selective presentation that parents offer and children receive without question. His mother had given him the whole of herself, in 12 pages, after the fact, and it was a gift with sharp edges that had cut him badly and that he would not have traded for anything. She had trusted him with the truth, even knowing what it contained, even knowing how it would land. She had decided he could hold it. He thought about that more than he thought about almost anything else, that she had believed he could hold it. Dottie Marsh became a regular at the center. Not an official volunteer, she refused that categorization with the vigor she applied to most categorizations. But she was there 2 afternoons a week with something she'd baked and opinions she distributed freely, and a quality of no-nonsense warmth that the residents responded to in a way that the more professionally trained volunteers sometimes didn't quite achieve. She and Landon had reached, over the years, something that neither of them would have called a friendship exactly, but that functioned like one. They disagreed regularly. Dottie thought he pushed the programming too hard in the early months. He thought she was too protective of certain residents who needed gentle challenge more than comfortable routine. They were both partially right, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. One afternoon in the center's 3rd year, Dottie found him in the small office off the main hall doing grant paperwork. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. This was standard Dottie procedure, and set a piece of coffee cake on the corner of his desk. "I owe you something," she said. He looked up from the paperwork. "I was hard on you," she said, "at the funeral and after. I don't think I was wrong. I want to be clear that I don't think I was wrong, because I wasn't, but I was also—" She moved her hand in a gesture that meant more than strictly necessary. "Your mother never asked me to be hard on you. That was my own thing, my own anger on her behalf. She would have told me to let you find your own way to it." Landon sat back in his chair. She would have been right. She was usually right, Dottie said. Infuriating quality. A silence between them that was almost comfortable. Almost. "She'd be—" Dottie started and then stopped. "You can say it," Landon said. "I was going to say she'd be proud," Dottie said, "but that's too simple. She was already proud of you. She was proud of you when you weren't doing anything to deserve it, which is how she worked, and I always thought it let you off too easy. But there it is." She looked at him. "What I think is that she'd be relieved, that you see it, what it was, what she was." Landon looked at the window. Outside, the Millhaven afternoon was doing what Millhaven afternoons did. Modest, Midwestern, unremarkable in the way of places where ordinary people live ordinary lives, and some of those lives are harder than they look from the outside. "I see it," he said. "Not all of it," Dottie said, with the precision he had come to expect from her. "You'll keep seeing it for years. Every time something happens here that reminds you, every time you sit with someone whose kid isn't coming." She picked up her coffee, looked into it. "That's not a punishment, it's just what it is." The center expanded in its 4th year. A second location, in a neighboring county where the need was demonstrably larger and the resources demonstrably smaller. Pauline ran the original location. Landon hired a director for the second, a woman named Carrie Bloom, who had run elder care programs for 12 years and who, in her interview, said the thing that made him hire her. "The loneliness isn't the problem. The loneliness is the symptom. The problem is that we built a culture where being old makes you invisible, and then we're surprised when invisible people feel alone." He thought about his mother arranging herself so the empty space didn't show, getting quite good at it. By the 5th year, the Harper Family Outreach Center had served over 300 individuals across both locations. The number was real, and Landon tracked it carefully. Not to impress anyone, but because he had been in finance long enough to know that what gets measured gets taken seriously, and he wanted this taken seriously. But he also knew what the number didn't capture, the specific weight of what it meant to be one of those 300. To be Agnes watching the garden on a Thursday afternoon and have someone sit down beside her and stay. To have that be a regular thing, an expected thing, not a charity event or a holiday visit, but just Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. People showing up because it was Tuesday, and that's what happened on Tuesdays now. He thought about what his mother had written about Eleanor Pace's son, what it means to a person to be visited, to be found by their child in the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary week. He was not those families. He could not give those people back the children who weren't coming. But he could fill some of the Tuesday afternoons, and he had learned enough by then to understand that this was not a small thing dressed up as a large one. It was a genuinely large thing, happening quietly, in a converted community space in Millhaven, Ohio, with good chairs and coffee that was better than Willowbrook's. Fish said, Landon and Cassandra did not have a perfect marriage after all of this. That should be said because the story is not one where the reckoning produces a clean, improved version of everything. Cassandra's observation, that she had noticed and not said anything and should have, had opened a conversation between them that was longer and more complicated than either of them had expected. There were things that needed to be named between them, patterns that had developed over years that the grief and the letter and the foundation work had illuminated without automatically resolving. They went to counseling. It was uncomfortable in the way that honest things are uncomfortable. They stayed in it longer than they initially thought they needed to, which was how they knew they needed to. What came out the other side was not the marriage they'd had before. It was something more careful, more deliberate, with more room in it for the harder conversations. Not better in a simple sense, more real. Cassandra, in one of those sessions, said something that stayed with Landon. I think we both got so good at managing everything that we forgot to just be in it. Your mother was in everything she did, all the way in. We were managing. He knew she was right. He had been managing his life the way his mother had managed her presentations of herself. Efficiently, effectively, at some cost to what was actually true underneath. The difference was that his mother had done it in service of protecting him, and he had done it in service of protecting his image of himself. Those are not the same kind of management, and he sat with that difference for a long time. But on the 5th anniversary of Evelyn Harper's death, Landon drove to Millhaven alone. He went to the cemetery first, a quiet place on the north edge of town, mature trees, the kind of ground that had been accumulating history for a long time. Her headstone was simple, the way she had specified to James Aldrin, her name, her dates. And below that, the one line she had asked for, which Landon had not known about until James Aldrin showed him the instructions. It read, "She paid attention." He stood in front of it for a long time, long enough that the afternoon shifted and the light changed and a slight wind came through the trees that had the quality of early autumn in Ohio, cool and green-smelling and something else underneath, the barely there edge of the season beginning to turn. He did not talk to the stone. That was not something he knew how to do, and he suspected his mother would have found it a little theatrical anyway. He just stood there, in the same way she had taught him to be present, not managing it, not performing it, just in it. Then he drove to the center. The Thursday afternoon program was running. 7 people in the common room, a volunteer reading aloud from a novel that someone had requested. 2 women playing cards in the corner with a focused intensity that suggested the game had stakes, however small. Agnes was in her usual chair by the window, watching the garden where Pauline's plantings had finally come in fully. Late-season flowers, the fence with the afternoon light coming through exactly right. Landon got himself a coffee and sat down beside Agnes. She glanced at him. "Anniversary today," she said. Not a question. "5th year," he said. Agnes nodded. She looked back at the garden. After a moment she said, "You know what I think about sometimes? What it took to write 12 pages of truth to someone you love, knowing they'd only read it after you were gone, knowing you'd never see their face when they did." She paused. "That's courage. Not the kind that gets talked about much, but that's what it is." Landon wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The same gesture, though he didn't know it, that Dottie had used at her kitchen table 3 years ago when she started telling him the things she'd been waiting to say. "She was braver than I ever gave her credit for," he said, "at everything." "Most mothers are," Agnes said. "Most people are, if you actually look." The reader in the corner turned a page. The card players made a small sound of triumph or protest. It was hard to tell which. Outside, the garden held the last of the afternoon light. This was what Evelyn Harper had built. In the end, not this room, not these chairs, not the programming or the second location or the 300 people or the grant funding that kept it running. Those things existed because of what she had built, but they were not the thing itself. The thing itself was this: a man sitting in a chair on a Thursday afternoon, paying attention, all the way in, not managing it. She had written 12 pages so he would know what the foundation was. He had read them, and the reading had cost him something real. And he had gotten up from James Aldrin's desk, and he had tried to stand correctly. He was still trying. He would be trying for the rest of his life, which was probably the honest shape of how these things work. Not a moment of transformation, but a sustained, imperfect daily effort to be the person the people who loved you believed you could be. Evelyn Harper had believed it. She had written it down in her ordinary handwriting, on the nice stationery she saved for things that mattered. And she had sealed it and given it to a quiet man named James Aldrin and trusted it to find her son after she was gone. It had found him. He was here. That was not everything, but it was not nothing. And in the long, quiet arithmetic of a life, of what we owe each other, of what love actually costs and what it actually builds, not nothing is where everything worth having begins.